little bit about brain injury support and higher education. So like colleges or anything like that. For many people after a brain injury, the brain injury was not something that they ever saw coming or had in their life plan. So many desire the same things that they had already planned before their injury: a college, a job, house, relationships. So we really wanted to ask the question, what does accessing such as college look like after brain injury, and how can we prepare and successfully work towards that goal for people to be able to accomplish their goals after an injury, and make sure that that doesn't stop them from accessing the community in the way that they want. So I'm really thankful to have Mary Lou Porch here with us today to talk about this really important topic of support in higher education. I'm going to let her give a little bit more background as to who she is and what brings her here today. So I'm going to stop share and allow her to kind of transition her slides. But I'm just really thankful to have her here with us today. I met her many years ago in the brain injury world, and since then she's transitioned into the college accommodations and disability coordination world. And so I knew that when I had, this topic in mind, I wanted to reach out to her. She's a wealth of information, and I'm just so thankful to have this topic. So I'll transfer it over to you, Mary Lou. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Lauren. It's great to be here, everyone. As Lauren said, my name is Mary Lou. I am a coordinator of disability support services at Wake Tech Community College in Raleigh, North Carolina. Just a little bit about me. I am a North Carolina native, which I feel like is becoming a little more rare these days. I grew up just outside of Greensboro, so I've lived in North Carolina my whole life. I have a Master of Science in Rehabilitation Counseling and Psychology from UNC Chapel Hill's School of Medicine. Lauren and I actually went to the same program. I am a certified rehabilitation counselor and a licensed clinical mental health counselor. I've worked in higher education for a little over 7 years now, which is crazy to me. Prior to that, I worked with individuals with brain injury as a cognitive rehabilitation therapist. And then before that, I did in-home therapy with children and adolescents. So we'll be covering quite a bit today. We'll talk about brain injury and the college population, different ways that brain injury can affect learning and the college experience. We will talk about accommodations at the college level, how those differ from high school. So if you're working with students who are kind of making that transition from high school to college, this will hopefully be helpful to you as well. We will talk about plenty of examples of accommodations, including some assistive technology that might be useful to students with brain injuries, in particular, those types of diagnoses. We'll talk about disclosure in the college classroom. And then towards the end, we will have a couple of brain injury case studies where we can kind of work through some examples of students who have brain injury and are navigating the college process, and some general tips as well. So this will probably be review for a lot of you, but just to sort of set the stage for what we're talking about today, we have a lot of individuals in the US who are living with a brain injury. So nearly 5.3 million Americans are currently living with disabilities resulting from brain injury. There are many causes of this, but the most common causes of brain injury include vehicle crashes and falls. And probably the most relevant piece of information for this presentation is that the highest incidence of brain injury occurs in youth and young adults ages 15 to 24. So, let's think about that age range, 15 to 24. What were you doing at age 15 to 24? A lot is going on during that time. You're finishing up high school, dating, taking the SATs. So we've got some standardized testing going on, getting your driver's license. So this is really big. Students are sort of making that transition into independence. They've gotten their driver's license so they can get a part-time job. They can go out with their friends, applying for college, attending college, and hopefully graduating if everything is on track, and then applying for jobs or graduate school. So there is a lot going on. There's a lot of decision making during these sort of formative years. And if we think back at that highest incidence of brain injury being 15 to 24 years, let's look at this other demographic that we have here. The average age of a traditional college student is 18 to 24 years. And this is significant because there's so much overlap between these two populations. Because of this overlap, students with brain injury do have a growing presence on college campuses. To illustrate this, there is a research study that was done in 2019. Researchers looked at college-age students at a Northeastern university in the United States who had a history of brain injury or concussion. They found that the prevalence of concussion or TBI was actually higher than previously reported in adult and college populations. So it was 51.7% compared to roughly 10 to 25%. So it was much higher than previously thought. And researchers also learned that campus disability services were underutilized in that study population. And one other thing that I read about this study is that those services were more underutilized by male students than female students. So let's talk about some of those impacts on learning and the college experience that can occur because of a brain injury. So we have speech and language. Potentially the student suffers from aphasia or some other type of speech disorder, which would impact their ability to speak up in class, to articulate those discussion question answers, to interact with peers and make small talk. Memory. How many of you had a hard time remembering where all of your classes were that first few days or weeks? So now imagine having an increased difficulty in memory as a result of a brain injury. And then, other things, trying to remember classmates' names and peers when you're introduced to them. Attention. So paying attention in numerous situations, such as class lectures, paying attention when you meet people for the first time and you're learning details about them. Reasoning skills, abstract thinking skills, especially depending on what classes you're taking. These can definitely be impacted. Judgment. So we know that this demographic generally doesn't have maybe the best judgment, but then you think about college students making all sorts of decisions, whether these are socially motivated or academically motivated. They're making judgments about and decisions about their personal safety, about their friends' personal safety, what environments or are safe or not safe to be in. They're making decisions about classes, things like that. So a lot of decision making going on while they're in college. Spatial awareness. They might have a harder time navigating campus as a result of that brain injury, especially since it's unfamiliar territory. Problem solving, psychosocial behavior, information processing is a big one because there is so much new information being thrown at you those first few days and weeks of college. And it really doesn't stop. I think you just sort of get used to that constant influx of information. Executive functioning skills. So this is really big in college. I mean, I feel like all college students struggle with this in the beginning, but starting and finishing tasks, staying on task, regulating emotions, um, self-motivating, can you set an alarm in the morning so that you can get to class on time? So all of these things that are kind of under that executive functioning umbrella can be impacted. Seizures. So if you have a seizure disorder as a result of a brain injury, this can in turn impact the student's ability to drive on campus. Balance and coordination, visual impairments. I've had at least one student on my caseload who has a visual impairment as a result of a brain injury. So it's quite common. So all of these affected cognitive processes and skills are going to be needed in college in different ways during the application process. So not even, in college, but getting to college, you have to keep track of when applications are due and prioritizing those applications according to deadlines, applying for financial aid, keeping up with assignments. I really do feel that those organizational skills and time management skills and prioritizing of tasks, I would say that out of all the students I see, this is an issue across the board, whatever the disability may be. So this is definitely an area of concern. Interacting with peers, some type of language and social skills are needed for developing that satisfying social life, which is a huge part of the college experience. And driving, we mentioned that before. So if your ability to drive is impacted by a brain injury, this can impact how far away you choose to move for school. Living independently on or off campus. There are lots of options for both, but depending on the severity of the brain injury and the level of functioning of the student, these decisions are going to be impacted. Navigating campus. Is there a mobility impairment to consider? Is there a visual impairment to consider? Maybe the student needs O&M training on campus prior to the start of classes. So if you are a service professional, which it seems like according to the poll, there's a lot of service professionals here today, or if you're a parent working with a student who has a brain injury and you are sort of assisting them to prepare for college, then they may need additional support in several areas. They're going to need assistance with planning, time management. So when do they study? When do they work? How much time should they be devoting to each task? And we talked about, just getting up in the morning. Can they self-motivate and set an alarm to get to class on time? Most adolescents struggle with that anyway. Management of schedules is really big because students are going to have their class schedules and then they're going to have their work schedules on top of that. Self-monitoring. So this is really big because, is that student able to tell when they've done too much or when they have reached their limit and they need to seek help or counseling or some type of other support services on campus. So they might need assistance with that too. And then assistance with navigating available services on campus, which we will talk a lot more about in depth as the presentation progresses. Hopefully this student that you are working with is going to an institution that has services available for students with disabilities, which should be all of them. They should all have some type of disability services available to students. So that process of getting connected isn't difficult, but it is a process that needs to be followed. So if you are a service professional or parent working with a student with a brain injury, you might want to take more of a driver's seat approach in the beginning, just to sort of help them to get things set up. And then of course the goal is to, back off a little bit, as the semesters go by to allow the student to sort of increase those self-advocacy skills. So I've talked a lot the past few slides about the challenges facing students with brain injury who want to pursue college, but I mean, there are incredibly amazing benefits too for any student with a brain injury who wants to further their education. You know, many aspects of attending college, like the daily challenges of navigating a new environment, that constant mental stimulation, learning a new routine and then sticking with the routine, all of these sort of provide natural cognitive retraining. In my prior job, I worked as a cognitive rehabilitation therapist, and so many of the activities that we did with our clients are sort of already there in place in college. You know, you have to learn to use the planner. You have to know your schedule. You have to remember how to get to the library or the bookstore or the dining hall. So it is putting students with a brain injury in an environment that sort of forces them to exercise these parts of the brain that they, you know, and they're making these connections that they might not have made otherwise. And then of course, you know, that retraining, you want that to lead the student with the brain injury to just attain that maximum level of independence that would not have been possible otherwise. And then the end goal, of course, is for that graduate to find gainful and fulfilling employment and improve self-esteem. You know, we want them to be functioning and happy members of society, and college can really, really put them on the right path to successfully achieve that. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap between this potentially amazing experience and a student with a brain injury related disability? And we connect them with disability services offices. So these are called different things on different campuses. It might be called the Disability Resource Office or Office of Accessibility, but they all provide academic accommodations for students with disabilities. So as we begin to talk more about these accommodations, I wanted to just briefly touch on the laws that govern the institutions that provide them. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act protects any student who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activity against discrimination. And colleges can provide reasonable accommodations to students with documented disabilities who may require academic or non-academic accommodations for equal access to college facilities, academic programs, and other activities. So you've heard me talk about a reasonable accommodation. I know that most people are used to hearing about the term or hearing the term reasonable accommodation in the context of a work environment, but accommodations do apply to academic settings too. So if we look at the definition from a work perspective, a reasonable accommodation is a change or a modification in the work environment that would allow a person with a disability to enjoy equal work opportunities. Similarly, under Section 504, public entities such as colleges are required to provide appropriate academic adjustments to students with disabilities. So when we talk about like what is a reasonable accommodation, I feel like sometimes it's better to explain what is considered unreasonable. So you know, we'll have some examples of this. And an accommodation is considered unreasonable in college if it poses a direct threat to the health and safety of others, you know, kind of a no-brainer. You don't want your accommodation that you are requesting to jeopardize someone else or put them in harm's way. it is considered unreasonable if it substantially changes an essential component of the curriculum. An example I like to use for this is a nursing student. Say you have a nursing student with a brain injury, and that student requests an accommodation that changes how they are assessed during a practical exam. You know, maybe they want to be exempt from a certain part of it. The DSS office likely would not grant that accommodation because there are certain skills that the student has to demonstrate to pass the class and become a nurse. So what would typically happen is the DSS office and the nursing department together have to look at an alternative that would still accommodate the student, but not change the essential component of the curriculum. And I do want to stress that any situation like this, and these are always really, really interesting. If you go to conferences and they talk about accommodations, but there are just so many different ways that an alternative accommodation could be, that they could come up with that and implement it. So, you know, no two cases are going to be exactly the same. But some other ways that an accommodation is considered unreasonable is if by providing the accommodation, it would substantially change the way you provide your services as a DSS office, or if the accommodation provides an undue financial or administrative burden. So say you have a student with a brain injury who, or any disability, who is asking for this really expensive piece of assistive technology. And the university is just like, no, we can't afford that. We absolutely don't have the funds. So then, you know, if they absolutely cannot do it, then they have to come up with an alternative that is as comparable as they can make it so that the student is still being accommodated. So I am going to talk a little bit about high school versus college, because I know that some of you might be working with students who are in high school, they're transitioning to college, or maybe you have children of your own, or maybe you are, you know, a high school student who is wanting to go back or wanting to go to college. This form is actually on our website, on Wake Tech's website. I'm going to break it down so that we can actually talk about what is on here. But one thing I do want to say is that there are some very clear distinctions between services in high school and services in college. And one of the biggest differences is that as a student with a disability in college, you are responsible for being your own advocate. Disability law simply mandates that a college provide reasonable accommodations. These accommodations are there to provide equal access, but not to guarantee success. So you must continue as a student, or if you are working with a student, encourage them to continue to talk to faculty and staff about their needs, which I know is a lot easier said than done. So you know, there are supports in place and there are people who can assist with learning how to self-advocate. So let's talk about the laws a little bit, high school versus college. So in high school students are protected under Section 504 as well, just a different subsection of that, and they are also protected under IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So under those laws, children with disabilities are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. In college, under the ADA, students cannot be denied admission due to disability, but they must be otherwise qualified for college. They still got to get in like everybody else. In high school, accommodations might look a little bit different. So you might have more shortening of assignments, notes on tests are sometimes seen. or other accommodations that are not available to other students. In college, there is more of a focus of maintaining academic standards. So no accommodation can fundamentally alter a class or program. You don't really see shortening of assignments as often, and allowing notes during exams is not considered an appropriate accommodation in college. In high school, there is more of a wraparound approach, I guess you could say. So there are IEP meetings. An IEP is an individualized education plan, and that involves teachers, counselors, and parents who are sort of, rallying around that student. They have meetings throughout the year. In college, that it just doesn't exist. You don't have that. You have accommodation plans, but the IEP does not exist. So in high school, as we mentioned before, there is more of a guarantee of success. In college, there is a guarantee of access. So a little bit about the responsibilities in high school versus college. So in high school, students are identified and supported by teachers and parents. In college, they do have to self-identify to the DSS office, which we'll talk about that a little bit more later when we talk about the accommodations process and disclosure. But in high school, there's just more responsibility for accommodations that falls on the school. And in college, more of that responsibility is put onto the student who chooses whether or not to use those approved accommodations in each class. In high school, teachers have a copy of that IEP. They usually attend those meetings that discuss those individualized plans. In college, instructors do receive a notification that the student is registered with a disability services office, but it's just a little bit different because that letter is not going to state what the student's disability is or give any diagnostic information. So if a student chooses to disclose more, it is completely up to them. And just a little bit about parental involvement. In high school, there's just going to be more of it. You're going to have parents involved in those IEP meetings. They're going to have access to students' grades automatically. They will often receive calls or emails when a student is not performing well in class, whereas in college, this just really is not the case. So parents are not going to have immediate access to those disability records without written consent from the student. Similarly to grades. So in college, there's FERPA, and we have a similar law in place for our disability records. So we have to have the student sign off that their parent can speak to us about disability related information before we can even talk to the parent. So in high school, I mentioned that before about parents receiving calls. So in college, instructors and DSS staff typically are going to communicate more with the student than the parents. So we talked a lot, about those differences, but now, we're going to move into talking more about the process of registering for those accommodations. So in college, they are going to require a student to submit documentation of a disability. That institution's disability services office is going to review that documentation. And then the student is going to be assigned to a coordinator or a counselor or an access consultant. They're called different things at different institutions, who will meet with that student to discuss the student's approved accommodations. Now, this is going to look a little bit different depending on the institution and the size of the institution. So at smaller colleges, you're likely to have just a few or one they might be a one-person show, a staff member who is in charge of reviewing the documentation and implementing the accommodations. At Wake Tech, we have several campuses, so we have to have a coordinator like myself present on all of those campuses so that we can mirror those services as much as possible. Because it's very common for a student to take classes on different campuses throughout their time at Wake Tech. So let's talk about documentation, because documentation is kind of the key. You know, you have to have documentation if you are setting up disability services at a college. It should always be as detailed as possible to ensure that the student is getting the accommodations that are right for them. That documentation should always include a diagnosis, and it will need to discuss the student's functional limitations and ideally how their disability impacts their learning. And this is in place so that the student can get what they need to be successful. You know, accommodations don't guarantee success, but we really want the student to be successful. So we want to get them on that right path with the accommodations that are right for them, which is why this is so important. Some examples of documentation that would be accepted at a college or university include psychoeducational evaluations. So these reports are produced at the end of a psychoeducational evaluation that is often done in high school to establish those IEP services. So most students who come to us who have an IEP, we know they have an evaluation, and that's usually what we end up asking for, because that is going to have all of the information we need so that we can tailor those accommodations to the student. And oftentimes these evaluations will indicate if that student has a learning disability, you know, as a result of the brain injury or anything else. A lot of other things, including functional limitations, are discussed in those types of evaluations. Letters from pediatricians or general practitioners. So these letters from a physician can state the diagnosis and provide a list of functional limitations. Letters from therapists. So if you are working with a student who has a mood disorder, or if they're seeing a therapist regularly and that therapist is able to discuss the diagnosis and discuss those functional limitations and how their brain injury or their mood disorder or whatever it may be is impacting their learning, that documentation can be submitted as well. Another example includes documentation from an audiologist, an ophthalmologist, or any other licensed medical professional. Some more considerations with accommodations are that you have to remember it is an interactive process. So sometimes it takes some back and forth and discussion to figure out what is going to work best for that student. And this is good, actually, because it means that, if they don't get it right the first time, they're going to come back to it. The student should talk to their DSS coordinator or whoever their contact is in DSS, and they're going to, let them know, hey, this isn't really working. And then that DSS contact hopefully will be able to say, okay, let's look at your documentation again. Let's have a conversation and we can figure out what we need to change, or maybe there is a new diagnosis and that student needs additional accommodations. So these are just things to think about. That coordinator or counselor that the student has been assigned to will be the student's first point of contact if that student has questions about how to use accommodations, if they need additional support, or if they need to be referred to other resources on campus. And then the level of support will vary depending on the school. This is true. I worked at 2 different colleges, and one was a 4-year university, and then I currently work at a community college, and they're just different. You know, they have, well, they're different in some ways. They have similar documentation requirements, but different levels of support. So at the community college, I would say there is maybe a little more in terms of support counseling that is located in DSS. There might be some additional study assistance for those students registered with DSS, but in my experience at the 4-year university, they had more to offer in terms of assistive technology. So it just kind of depends on the institution, their level of funding, their level of staff. So just some other things to think about. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Hey there are a few questions.
Okay.
So some brain injuries, exacerbate emotional unbalances or instability. Do higher education institutions make accommodations for documented emotional support animals for students with mental health challenges?
They do actually. And I have a slide dedicated to that exact question. So I'm really glad you asked. So I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. Yeah.
Perfect. Can the student work with vocational rehabilitation to help with the accommodations and supports for schooling? And what supports have you seen given to them?
So I have definitely met a few students who are working with VR, and the level of involvement from VR varies depending on the student. I just met with a student a couple of weeks ago whose supported employment specialist came with him to the appointment. They were there to sort of advocate for the student. But in terms of accommodations, there's still the DSS office is still looking at that documentation. But yes, we do have students who are working with VR who are registered with our office.
Okay, just a follow-up for that. Is there specific recommendations that you have for individuals that maybe either want to get connected with VR or something, but that they feel like maybe they're not as familiar with brain injury or don't have a visible injury, and so they might be hesitant to connect with vocational rehabilitation? Have you seen that at all? Or any recommendations you have for making invisible injuries more visible?
Well, I have never worked for VR, but I know that there are a couple of folks on staff who have, and I think that some of it falls on being comfortable with disclosing. And we're actually going to talk about disclosure in a little while, and I think some of those tips might help answer that question.
Perfect. How do you balance the support of the student when they are not their own guardian? What are some ways that you've facilitated this in the past?
So that can be a little tricky. And as a DSS professional, I have to balance communicating with the parent and the student. So if they're not their own guardian, they're going to have the guardian is going to have permission to access those records and to communicate with DSS. So we just try to keep an open dialogue with the student and the parent. For me personally, I always include both the student and the parent or guardian and email communications if it's that type of situation. I often will talk with the student and ask them what is your personal preference for information sharing, just to make sure that I am still communicating necessary information to the person who is keeping track of everything, like deadlines and things like that. But at the same time, I want to respect the student. And I want to make sure that they're also being included in all of the discussions and the information sharing.
Perfect. And the last question that I see currently is, and I know that you might be getting to this later, but what is the process for a college student to use a live scribe smart pen?
I have a video for that. Yes, so we're actually going to talk about that in just a moment.
All right, perfect. All right, that's it for now.
All right, thank you guys. Those are really great questions. So, and we're going to get right into those accommodations actually, which is really kind of fun and interesting to talk about. We're going to talk about testing accommodations, classroom accommodations. But I do want to preface this by saying that these are all just examples of accommodations that are frequently used and provided in higher education. It's important to remember that they may not fit each and every student with a brain injury, and it really just comes down to that individual's functional limitations and what they need assistance with. So all of these are going to be determined on an individual basis when you're meeting, or when your student is meeting with a DSS office. And those accommodations might differ between two students with a brain injury. So some testing accommodations that we frequently see include a quiet testing room, a computer use for essays. This is really important for students who might have some fine motor impairment as a result of their brain injury, and typing is a little bit easier for them than writing out a lengthy response. Extended testing time. We usually see it either as time and a half or double time. Time and a half would be where we multiply whatever the class is getting by 1.5. And just straight across the board, that's how we calculate that student's extended time. Or we multiply it by 2 for double time. Screen reading software and other assistive technology. I will talk to you guys a little bit more about some examples of assistive technology. Calculators, we see this sometimes for students who have a learning disability in math. The ability or the permission to mark answers on your test rather than your Scantron. This comes in handy if you have a student with a brain injury who has trouble tracking. So if they can just mark that answer on their test, circle the answer, and not have to worry about doing the bubble sheet, it makes their life a lot easier. A private room for testing, there may be a variety of reasons for that. Breaks without penalty. So if we have a student who has, high anxiety, or they need to take frequent restroom breaks during the exam, this accommodation can be quite useful. Some classroom accommodations might include access to audiobooks. Usually nowadays there is an audio or electronic version of a textbook, but if there isn't, the DSS office should be able to convert that just traditional textbook into an electronic format. Note-taking assistance. So this can include a smart pen. This can also include a volunteer note taker, or sometimes we have like paid note takers. This really just depends on the university and their funding. How much do they have available for paid note takers? Some other note taking options. Oh, recording. So this is a big one, which kind of goes hand in hand with the live scribe pen. But we will typically give students permission to record their lectures. Alternative format materials. This could be anything from brailled materials to converting a paper document into an electronic document, preferential seating. I see this a lot with my students who have PTSD. You know, sitting in certain places in the classroom might be a trigger for them. And so we try and keep that in mind during the accommodations process. Priority registration. This could come in handy in a lot of ways. So, you know, if you have a student, for example, who is taking medication that makes it so that they're really sleepy in the morning, giving them priority registration so that they can register early and get that class schedule put in place to avoid early morning classes is really going to set them up for success. Or if you have a student with a mobility impairment, they might want to spread their classes out across the day to give them adequate time to go from point A to point B. Accessible seating arrangements. I have a student now who has a disability where he has a hard time getting up or getting in and out of chairs, like traditional height chairs. And so we gave him an accommodation where he has, I think it's a drafting chair. It's one of those higher chairs, kind of like a perching stool. And then there is an accessible desk. So he has a wheelchair height desk that can be raised to accommodate the chair. So there's just all kinds of creative things that can happen in the accommodations area. Service animals, which we'll talk about on the next slide, and reduced course load. So reduced course load can come in handy if a student has a learning disability or an intellectual disability, or if they're just having a hard time with, you know, completing all of those homework assignments. We will often recommend that a student take a reduced course load. So if you are a person with a brain injury who has a service animal, and you ask, can I bring that animal to college? The answer is yes. So service animals under the ADA, state and local governments, businesses, nonprofit organizations, including colleges that serve the public must allow service animals to accompany people with disabilities in all areas of the facility where the public is allowed to go. You know, service animals are not actually required to be registered with a disability services office for that reason, because under the law, they should be allowed to go wherever the public can go. Now, emotional support animals are different. So we do require emotional support animals to get registered with our office. Well, the animal is not getting registered, but the student is getting registered with the office. So we do require that, but please check with the specific school because they might have slightly different requirements. So we're going to talk about assistive technology for a little while here. I'm going to provide a few examples of commonly used assistive technology that may be provided at a college or university. So text-to-speech software is pretty common. This basically includes any kind of screen reading software. A popular one is Kurzweil 3000. I've also seen colleges use Read and Write Gold. There are other options. I'm sure there are a million options of assistive technology, text-to-speech software. They will read, at least this particular software, it will read PDFs. It has multiple languages. There are other nice little features included in that software, such as note-taking and chapter summaries. Natural Reader is another one that we often see students use because it's free. So they can use it at their house, which is immensely helpful. They can listen to school notes, office documents, printed books from the computer or a mobile device, dictation software. We see this a lot for students who might have fine motor skills impairment, or if they have a disability where they just need to be able to speak out loud in order to get those thought processes going and to get their thoughts on paper. And then the Smart Pen. So yeah, Smart Pen note-taking support. These pens are fantastic. And I know that when I worked at the four-year university, they just handed them out to students. They had a lot of them and students could check them out like a library book. It was amazing. So I know that they can be a little pricey. They cost at least $100 per pen, depending on what model you get. But I will say that if a student has a LiveScribe pen, that can be included in note-taking provisions. So if they have an accommodation where they get recording privileges, then the Smart Pen would count as that because it does record. I'm actually going to show you guys a little demo video about the LiveScribe pen. So give me just a moment to get that for you. Lauren, can you tell me if you can see the video?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect.
This is the Echo Smart Pen from LiveScribe. What makes it smart? It records everything you hear, write, and draw and links the audio to your notes. Just tap on your notes to replay what was said at that point in time. It records everything you hear, write, and draw. Tap on your notes to replay what was said at that point in time. Here's how it works. First, tap the record button in your notebook. The Smart Pen starts recording everything you hear and write. Write notes, draw a diagram, mark important stuff. Then tap stop to finish recording. Later, you can replay the audio by tapping on your notes. The Smart Pen speed up or slow them down as you need. Everything you hear and write. Write notes, draw a diagram to get exactly what you need. Mark important stuff. One Smart Pen, huh?
All right, so as you guys can see, it does quite a lot. Let me just get back to the presentation.
While you're doing that, we just had one quick question. What's the average cost of that pen?
So I looked this up the other day for a student who was interested in it. I feel like it was around, well, there are different models. So I feel like they generally run somewhere between $100 to $150. So they're not cheap. But if you are planning on, attending college and it's it would be an investment. It definitely would be an investment. All right, guys. So we are gonna continue with the presentation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, or we're going to begin talking about disclosure, because I know that this is often a concern. Students want to know how much should they tell the instructor, what should they tell the instructor. And it really just depends on a lot of things. So students are not required to disclose anything to instructors to receive accommodations. Typically, students will go through the Disability Services Office. So the student with the disability will disclose to DSS and then go through the registration process. Then DSS will communicate necessary information to the instructors. Now, this varies slightly depending on the school, because where I have worked, DSS will send an accommodation letter or accommodation notice to the instructor. But I know that some institutions just give that accommodation letter to the student, and then the student is responsible for distributing it to their instructors. One thing that is for sure is the diagnosis, and any personal information is typically not included in the notice, just the student's accommodations. So anything else that they want to share, whether it is the exact disability, or if they want to talk more about their limitations based on that disability, that's completely optional and up to the student. Some general tips for disclosure. Know how your brain injury impacts your learning. So this is something that I would definitely recommend for any student with a brain injury who is wanting to attend college, and they want to be able to talk about that brain injury with others. Know how it impacts your learning. Is it your memory that is impacted the most? Is it the way you process information? Do you need information broken down into chunks? Do you need to make lists for everything? These are all things that would be good to know about yourself so that you can have these conversations with others. Know what strategies work for you. As a student, maybe you need your slides printed out before class so that you can take notes onto the slides. Maybe it works better for you to do something completely different. And don't be afraid to reach out to the instructor for assistance. This is something else I tell my students. You don't have to disclose anything to them, but sometimes it is helpful. And you may find that they have had students with similar issues in the past, especially if that instructor is a little bit more seasoned and they've been around for a while. They've most definitely had other students who are registered with DSS. So you may not be telling them something new, and they may actually have suggestions and strategies that they can show you that will, make you be more successful, which is what we all want. And again, don't feel pressured to tell them every detail. If you're working with a student who just isn't sure if they want to go that route and disclose personal information, they don't have to. That's what disability services does. So, well, we don't disclose their personal information, but we are going to share that necessary information about their accommodations with the instructor. And general tips that I would have for any student who is wanting to get connected with an accommodations office, with a disability services office, is to research that particular office. So if a student is considering a certain college, I would say reach out to that college's disability services office as part of your process for determining if you want to go there. Familiarize yourself with your college's documentation requirements. There are so many things to consider with that alone. Do they take IEPs from high school? Do they take copies of an accommodations plan from a previous school? Because some don't. Some want the documentation that plan is based on. Keep good records. So store any of those psychoeducational evaluations or other medical records electronically or in a hard copy file. This is kind of like adulting 101. You have to learn to keep records of everything. Apply early. So offices will sometimes have either a deadline or at least a suggested timeline for establishing services, but you still want to check with that particular office to where you are applying. Oh, and I would say it's always a good idea to apply before school starts. So if you're working with a student, just let them know, getting in touch over the summer, like if they're starting in August, get in touch with that DSS office in June or July. It definitely doesn't hurt just to kind of get that ball rolling ahead of time. So I think I mentioned this briefly, making those accommodations questions part of the process in determining what school you want to go to. And I do think that that is true. If accommodations is going to be a big part of that student's college experience, then I definitely recommend taking that into consideration and asking them plenty of questions. Some of those questions might include, number one, does the school have a DSS office? They should, or at least have a representative who can provide accommodations. If so, how large is the staff? Is there an assistive technologist on staff? If you are working with a student who loves their assistive technology and they use quite a few different things, maybe they use a screen reader, maybe they use dictation software, it might be setting them up for greater success if they attend a school that has the ability to provide those assistive technologies. Is there a timeline for establishing services? Are there any brain injury support groups on campus? And if there's not one on campus, maybe there are some nearby in the community. How accessible are the buildings? Is it a really old campus? Are things confusing? Is it easy to navigate the campus? If I want to take a reduced course load, how will it affect my financial aid? So this is very important because, we see students who have different types of financial aid. Some of that financial aid is dependent on taking a specific number of credit hours. So I would say for that student, reach out to the school, talk to them about how that will be impacted. They're probably going to have to talk to the Disability Services Office and financial aid. Well, I know they will have to talk to financial aid for that specifically. So that is definitely a good thing to keep in mind. Before we jump into our case studies, does anybody have any questions about any of the earlier pieces of information from the presentation?
I haven't seen any come in since the previous one.
Okay.
So unless anybody has pressing questions, we will have maybe some time after the case studies as well.
Okay, sounds good. So we have a couple of case studies here. I'm going to read these scenarios to you all, and then we're just going to talk about them, and we're going to talk about, what these students could have done differently, maybe some suggestions for them moving forward based on the information that we've learned today. So first we have Josh. Josh is a freshman at a local community college. He sustained a brain injury his senior year in high school. He spent a year in rehabilitative care and delayed entering college. He is functioning well, driving on his own, and has a part-time job at a grocery store. Josh's family decided that starting at a community college might be a better plan for Josh to sort of get his feet wet, then transfer to a 4-year university later. His parents have been very involved in getting his accommodations set up for college, but Josh is less interested, which I see that sometimes. He doesn't feel that he needs them because overall he thinks he is doing well. However, Josh still struggles with attention, concentration, and executive functioning skills. Josh completes the registration process with DSS. His accommodations include extended testing time, a quiet testing room, audio recording privileges, reduced course load, and support counseling sessions. Josh does not sign up to use his testing accommodations on his first test and does not pass the test. He continues to struggle with time management and staying on top of his coursework. Before he knows it, Josh is failing the class. Panicked, he makes an appointment with his DSS coordinator. So there's kind of a lot going on with Josh. Let me ask you guys, what seems to have gone wrong in Josh's situation? Let's ask that question first. If you guys want to type in the chat, what do you think went wrong with Josh? Then we can start to talk about that a little bit.
We have comments saying that, Josh didn't buy into the program, that he wasn't involved with the accommodations and was not a self-advocate, not recognizing his need or disability. So maybe some self-awareness there. His parents were more interested in supports than Josh. His parents were way too involved and in charge.
Yeah. So I would say that this is a very common scenario. I see this so often. It's definitely not unusual for parents to be more invested in accommodations than students, especially if that student has been functioning really well in their environment leading up to college. But college is different, it's a totally different environment. So I would say, in Josh's situation, being more forward focused would be beneficial. Josh might be one of those unfortunate situations where we can't really salvage the class, but we have to focus on what to do right the next time. So I would just say, for Josh to focus on his classes moving forward, it would be possible for him to take an incomplete. So sometimes we'll have students who take an incomplete because they're having such a hard time in the class, and then they can actually finish the class in the next semester. They would just, there would be a specific date by which they had to turn in all of their assignments that they had not completed yet. He could also retake the class. And if a student like Josh, came to me telling me about all of these unfortunate circumstances, I would just encourage him to use his accommodations going forward, and meet with the DSS coordinator, because we want to set him up for success. It's possible that he might need additional accommodations too. He could talk with his DSS coordinator. They could set up maybe a weekly or every other week check-in, just to make sure that he was using all of those accommodations and that he was staying on top of things. So our second case study is a student named Sasha. Sasha is a second semester freshman at a 4-year university. She sustained a brain injury in a skiing accident when she was a child. Sasha had an IEP in high school and is registered with DSS at her university. She receives the accommodations of extended testing time, screen reading software, and audiobooks. She sometimes struggles with making sense of course material or lecture material when a lot of information is presented at once. She has found that she can process information better when it is broken down into smaller sections. Sasha is taking an abnormal psychology class this semester, which includes a lot of reading and lectures. She feels that her learning style is not very compatible with her instructor's lecturing style. Sasha finds that she is struggling to make sense of the material and is unsure of what to write down for notes. Frustrated, Sasha feels that she should just give up. She feels college-level courses are over her head because of her brain injury and accepts that she will not pass the class. So I feel bad for Sasha. Can you guys tell me what you think might have gone wrong with Sasha? You know, maybe there were some obvious mistakes she made. Maybe they weren't very obvious mistakes. Maybe she was trying everything she knew to try. But what are your thoughts about what went wrong in her situation?
So we have some thoughts coming in, she should communicate more with her instructor to solve the problem and help her learn the material.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so this is one of those times where Sasha should definitely consider disclosure, because it would probably benefit her in her situation. I would suggest to her that meeting with her professor would be a good idea. She could take that opportunity to actually share that she has a brain injury and explain her needs. She may find it an appropriate time to explain to the instructor that she needs information broken down into chunks. And another benefit is that the other students in the class might be able to see a benefit from having their course information presented in a different format. So, that just might be sort of an added bonus for other students in the class. I would definitely say that Sasha should connect with her DSS coordinator to explore other accommodations that could potentially be added onto her accommodations plan. And it may benefit her to connect with a tutor. I mean, she's definitely trying. She needs to not give up, for one, and she needs to use the services that are available to her. I have one more quick video to show you all. This is just a little success story about a student who sustained a brain injury and was able to recover and go back to school.
Come on, make a fist. Yeah.
Good job, Brett.
Now, can you do me a favor? Brett, can you open it up? Open up your fist. Open it up.
The accident was January 4th, 2016. It was Brett's freshman year in college. He was a biology major with the pre-med focus. Brett always wanted to be a doctor.
I was skiing one day with my dad, and I went off a jump, and I landed past landing like 10 feet and knocked myself unconscious. I actually wasn't breathing. My dad had to give me CPR. I was only given a 10% chance to live, and only given a 1% chance to live and be functioning.
They started therapy day one with Brett not even being conscious. They started bringing him back to life. Brett couldn't speak, and we kept trying to get him to talk. And they would ask, what music does Brett like? As soon as he started singing, Brett just belted it out. So that was Brett's first words, was that song during music therapy here.
He's always pushing himself. He's got an unbelievable attitude, and he's of the true believer of the positive, the growth mindset. Like if you think you can do it, you can do it.
At first, he couldn't walk at all. The first time they put Brett in the harness, the therapist would actually sit on the side and move his legs for him. So they would do it again and again and again. Then all of a sudden, Brett was able to start moving on his own. Brett was not able to breathe when he came here. He wasn't able to eat, walk. He couldn't do anything. So when we left here that day, Brett walked out the door, and we never thought he'd walk again.
My goals were running. I love running to this day. I just started driving. Well, I just changed my major, college, to rec therapy.
He wants to be a therapist and work with patients that have gone through and are going through similar problems with what he has.
When Brett went back to Indiana, it was awesome. I mean, you know, we had this kid that, you know, we had no idea like what his future was.
I know.
To see him like push and fight through such a silly accident that almost took his life. It was awesome.
You know, here at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, the therapists, like, they're family. He comes back here for neuropsych eval and exams, and he exceeds everything that they've expected.
You know, now I look at Brett, I think he's gonna do special things.
In his last exam, they told him, Brett, you can be and do anything that you want to be. You're doing it, you're proving it.
So as you guys can see, you know, just because a student has sustained a brain injury does not mean that they can't go back to college. They can succeed. In Brett's situation, he ended up changing his major so that he could help students who had gone through similar situations as him. So, you know, we see a lot of students who have gone through pretty incredible things, and they come to DSS and they get registered, and, you know, they're able to successfully complete those classes with those appropriate accommodations in place. I did want to provide a few resources for you all that, you know, you'll be able to access later. If you're working with a student who is preparing for post-secondary education, or if you are a parent and you're working with your child and sort of getting all of those ducks in a row to apply for school and apply for disability services. But with that, that concludes my presentation. So please let me know if you have any more questions.
That was excellent. I thank you so much. I do have a few questions, and then if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will be monitoring that. I just put a copy of the slides in the chat as well, and I'm also going to be putting Mary Lou's email as well, so you can contact her. So I'm going to do that right now before I start questions. Alrighty. So I have a question kind of related to, I love that video. I think it was so inspiring. And I think what's really important too is the idea, you know, for all professionals to create hope rather than, you know, telling people what they can't do. And I think that people find it difficult when someone maybe is wanting to go back to college, but maybe doesn't take into account like some of their challenges. Do you find that some people might be like striving for a major or career path that might be a little very challenging for them at this point in time? And how can like we help people that maybe there's a similar path that they can take that might not be as strenuous depending on their challenges with learning?
That's a really tricky question.
There's not really a good answer to it. So I am setting you up to fail, but I was just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, well, that's a really tricky question. I think part of it, I mean, you have to have conversations with the student to find out, like, so why are you wanting to pursue this? Because if you can get to sort of the root of why they want to pursue that, and you sort of get them talking, they might reach other conclusions on their own. That's sort of kind of goes back to my therapist days. So I mean, I think that we should never tell them that they shouldn't do it. But I think that helping them to sort of have a little bit more self discovery so that they might, as I said, reach different conclusions themselves.
Perfect answer to a very tricky question. We get that all the time. So that's why we just hear it, constantly, people having that struggle between, self-awareness and self-determination. I think that's really the heart of it.
Yeah.
I was recently doing a training in a group home here in North Carolina. And the caregivers were looking to prepare a resident for higher education. Are there any, supports, or how can people kind of like prep to, that college level experience, and make sure that they're ready and improve their skills for that? Is there any recommendations you have for that?
Yeah. So I think that I would say don't be afraid to just take one class, because I do see some students who come in and they're taking a full load and it's way too much. So I would say, don't be afraid to just take one class, but also, look and see what these colleges have, because especially at a community college level, they have continuing ed classes. If a student is not really, if they don't really know what they want to do and they aren't planning on transferring to a 4-year university, they can take non-curriculum classes where it doesn't really count towards a GPA. And they can, get their feet wet a little bit, like Josh did in our case study. He like went to a community college to get his feet wet before transferring to a 4-year university. So there's that, but there's also some colleges that have specific programs for students who might be functioning at a different level. Like we have a specific program. It used to be called the ABE TOPS program. I think it's called the Pathfinders program. I may be getting that wrong, so forgive me. But it is specifically for students who are not quite functioning at like a curriculum level. So maybe there is some intellectual disability going on or something else. So, those would be my suggestions for that student.
Perfect. Another question I have, you had mentioned disclosure to professors, and we always want to hope that every professor is very open to the idea of accommodations. Unfortunately, I've heard stories of, that kind of pushback from professors, and they still see kind of accommodations as like a leg up for students instead of like balancing and leveling the playing field. Are there resources, or like where can a student go if they're experiencing that kind of pushback from their professors, and what can be done so that they don't feel like they're, just at a loss?
They definitely need to go to their DSS coordinator or counselor or access consultant, whatever that person is called at their college, because this does happen. I mean, legally, the instructor can't push back. So sometimes you've got to have somebody from DSS who says that to them. And they're just like, okay, well, sorry, this is the law. You have to accommodate this student. Sometimes it doesn't have to go that far. Sometimes you can just have a conversation with the professor And then they will see, you know, maybe they've never had a student who is registered with DSS before. Maybe they're not really clear on the purpose of accommodations. So, you know, definitely I would say the student needs to connect with their DSS person, whoever that is, and then that DSS coordinator should communicate with the instructor. Maybe there needs to be some educating. And then if that doesn't work, I mean, the student still has to be accommodated. So legally, they can't choose to not accommodate the student just because they don't want to.
Excellent. Yeah, and I know we're over time, but I did have just one more question really that I wanted to focus on. But yeah, I appreciate that because it makes me think like, okay, well, maybe we need to be making a handout specifically for educators and, you know, training them about brain injury and possible accommodations, but
Yeah,
I digress.
Another project.
Right. I don't have enough to do. So we want to add to that. But so I can't help but think also, you know, we talked a lot about individuals that maybe be looking are looking to go into college, looking at the disability services. What about student athletes, if any, do you see related to concussion and those mild forms of brain injury? Do you see a lot of individuals accessing, you know, disability services, or is there any research on the utilization of disability services for a more mild form of brain injury?
So I know that research is out there because I stumbled across it when I was putting a few things together for this presentation. I couldn't really answer that right now. I know that it's out there. I know that it is. I mean, as far as our student population, I mean, it's going to be a little bit different with us because we don't have, you know, it's not like, you know, you go to another four-year university and they've got the football team. I mean, at the school that I worked at prior to this, one of the DSS coordinators, her entire caseload was TBI and ADHD and students with learning disabilities. And probably 75% of those students were student athletes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That, I mean, just that there shows you a lot there. And yeah, I think it could be its own presentation. So it's not, you know, it's nothing that we could fit in a couple of minutes for sure. But overall, I just want to thank you so much for this information. I think it's going to be really helpful to a lot of people out there, from, you know, people that are about to transition into college, that maybe have a brain injury and are now looking to go to work. And they're like, okay, how can I get into college? Or, you know, they're looking to be more active and they want to just start a few classes. So I think there's a lot of reach for this presentation that I'm just so thankful for. We do have a question, you know, related to credits and certificates. And so I'm going to put the link to the certificate in the chat here. You'll also get it in the follow-up email tomorrow. You can also go onto our website and there's a link there. If you're itching and you want to just get it done, you can go onto our education and learning. But overall, thank you so much, Mary Lou, for your presentation, your time, your energy. And I really hope that encourage you guys, if you have any additional questions, either reach out to us as the Brain Injury Association and we can get you connected, or email Mary Lou. And thank you for your advocacy and services. I look forward to collaborating with you in the future.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Have a wonderful day. Hope to see you next month for the Powerful Tools and for Caregivers webinar that we're doing during Caregivers Month.